Change only takes place when people change the way that they behave and the way that they work in organizations. That's what makes sure that change is implemented and sustained effectively. Change doesn't happen without people being engaged in it. And getting people involved as early as possible can ensure that change adds value and adds benefits to the change itself. What is it that's blocking leaders and managers from actually engaging people as early as possible? Sometimes it's a lack of capability. Sometimes it's a fear that if they start to ask the questions, what the answers will be as well. So I think that's why it's really important to develop managers so they have the capability to not just manage the change, but to facilitate the change too.
Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Hi everybody, it's Barry Eustance here from the Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Julie Hodges. Julie is a fantastic author who's written a book that we'll discuss, People-Centric Organizational Change. And Julie's background was through PwC as a senior consultant, Royal Bank of Scotland senior consultant, associate dean at Durham, and then Professor of Organisational Change. And I'll let Julie explain the background, her outstanding book, which I have reviewed on Amazon, and you must read it. And Julie, welcome to the Just Great People podcast.
Thank you, Barry, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. So thank you for the invitation to join you and the listeners as well. So yes, I've had an interesting background in terms of before I joined academia, I actually worked in the business world and global businesses for 20 years. And I began my career working with the British Council, then moved on to a startup company, which at the time was called Vertex, before moving into work with PwC, RBS, as you said, as well. So during that time, I did focus on leading and managing business transformation. And at a certain point in my career, I decided that actually I was very passionate about research, about teaching. I had done a PhD along the way that had looked at the impact of change on stress levels. And I decided I'd move into academia. And I love what I do. I have the best job ever in that I get the opportunity not only to teach about organizational change, but also to do research, consultancy, and to write books about it. And the People-Centric Organizational Change book is my 9th book, in fact, and already I'm giving some thought to the next book. And why I have written so many books is because when I originally moved into academia, I discovered that there were sort of two types of literature, broadly speaking. There's what I call the populist approach, which are these lovely little books that have nice illustrations in them. You pick them up in airport bookshops. They don't take much to read, but actually they don't tell us much about how we can effectively lead change. On the other side, there's an amazing amount of really important academic research that has been done, but often fails to look at the practical elements. So I decided that I would focus my research and writing in between. So doing my research based on people-centric change, writing about that in books, but also making sure that it wasn't just theory. It was how does this theory translate into practical recommendations that can be used by businesses across the world today. And I think gradually as I've gone through the research and the work that I do, I've begun to focus really much in an area that's passionate, I know, to both of us, which is about what I call people-centric change. And what's meant by that is, yes, when doing what I call planned business transformations, there's a need for a process. How will we do that? But just as importantly, there's a need for a focus on the people element. So it's having a seesaw where there's a balance between process and people. And what I have found through the work that I do, the consultancy work I do, and also through my research, is often that seesaw is out of balance. There's too much focus on the process without the people side of it. And ultimately, it's people that ensure that change is implemented and it's sustained in organizations as well. So that's why I thought I'm going to write a book on this whole subject to really get to grips with what do we mean by people-centric change and how can we get better at that within companies companies today and in the future.
And that's really highlighted what has been a significant missing component, hasn't it? The people element seems to be it seems to be process and technology at the expense of people. When I say at the expense, without that critical element of people, the processes and technology implementations are destined to fail. What I loved about the book, and I use it, as you know, is that it's a field guide. It's a practical field guide with summaries and with the ability to actually use it as you've intended. It's not an academic publication, nor is it a heavy read. It's so usable out the box that I feel it's, as you know, it's going to be a recommended a resource for our own people-centered change and transformation leadership course. It's that very practical element that I think you've uniquely captured in the book. In your practical experience with organizations, do you find that a lot are tripping over the process and the technology element of it without actually considering who's got to actually implement that change? Is that the reality there?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Barry. It's a really good question to ask. I think there's often so much focus on what is the system, what is the approach, what is the technology that we have to use, what is the AI method. All organizations are thinking of that today, and these are really important questions to ask. But they have to be asked alongside how do we get people involved in that? How do we get people involved in the decisions even before the change becomes a reality? How do we get the key stakeholders, the people that will be impacted, that will influence the change, involved in discussions as early as possible? Now, it's really important that I always caveat what I say with I recognize that sometimes change has to be implemented. It has to be implemented quickly. There's not time to sit around and have discussions about what's the best option. What I'm talking about is where there actually is some space to have discussions with key stakeholders, whether these are internal or external, because research shows that where stakeholders are involved as early as is feasible to do so, that the change is much more likely to achieve its benefits, so to improve, to decrease, etc., than change that is imposed on people. But as I say, I recognize that sometimes change has to be imposed if there's an urgency or if it's driven by regulations, government policy, etc. But I would strongly advocate that wherever feasible, it's important to identify who the key stakeholders are and get their views, get their ideas as well, because often it's the frontline staff who are doing the work that actually know much more about what needs to be improved and how it can be improved as well.
How many instances are you likely to face in practice where you can't actually engage stakeholders at an early stage of decision making and strategy overview and vision creation? I was involved in a very time critical event some years ago, and the clock was ticking, but the stakeholders were brought in at an early stage, and actually the net result was a better result that was much more readily accepted by, dare we say, the unwilling recipients. But there can't be that many out of thought instances where stakeholders can't be involved at the very earliest stages.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a crisis, obviously, when the pandemic hit, there wasn't, time to sit around. We all had to move to an online environment. If there's government policies or regulations that come out, so there are one or two times when it can happen. But I think it's about thinking about actually, let's get people involved as early as is possible, and that doesn't need to take a lot of time. You can have discussions, you can get people's views, you can get their hopes, their fears, their concerns, etc. And again, research shows that wherever people are given the opportunity to voice what could be done differently, but also importantly, not just to voice their ideas, thoughts, they're listened to, then again, it has a positive impact on the sustainability of change too.
It almost seems like a common sense statement, doesn't it? And yet it's not. Broadly, it's the people seem to be at the back of the pecking order when it comes to these change initiatives in
Yeah,
a lot of cases.
absolutely, because there's still far too much change that comes from the top of organizations downwards, rather than change coming from the bottom up or from different elements of it. Too much change is decided at the top, and then it's just cascaded down. And what happens then is it gets stuck at the middle of the organization, the so-called frozen middle, and these group of managers haven't been involved in any of the decisions, and the change gets stuck there. So then questions are asked about, well, why has this change not been implemented? Why has it not realized its benefits? Why are people resisting, opposing the change? Because people that should have been involved have not been involved.
Yeah, and the neuroscience, and I know that you're meeting Hilary Scarlett, another favourite author of ours, and one who will be appearing on a podcast very soon as well. The neuroscience really does emphasize that, and Hilary's book, Neuroscience for Organisational Change, is really, again, another fantastic field guide and easy to read, although the title seems quite daunting. It's an easy read. Because it gives a clear picture of why change and buy-in is so essential from a people's perspective. And by not involving people, the neuroscience suggests that the first thing that happens is they go into this sort of defensive fight flight kind of mode, which actually makes them resist change and makes the buy-in all the more difficult. Is there a formula that you would suggest to organizations, or is it as simple as involving stakeholders at the earliest stage possible?
So if you think about it, a couple of things. You have to recognize we all change all the time, don't we? We change jobs, we get married, we get divorced, we have kids, we move house. So it's not that we are not used to change. What people don't like is when change is imposed on them. So what we need to do is look at how do we engage those people? How do we engage stakeholders in change? And I've written a lot about this area. In the book, People-Centric Organizational Change, what I propose is what's called a business transformation cycle. And that has a number of steps that can be used when planning change. But what makes this different is the cycle is based on a number of principles. And these principles are all about how do we engage people. So, for example, one of the principles is about dialogue. And in an age of, e-communication, it's easy to forget about let's have a conversation with someone. And that conversation can be done in person, or as we're doing today, Barry, you can do online, in fact. So it's about looking at building dialogue in as part of any communication strategy for change, to give people, and often the voiceless, the opportunity to raise their views and their concerns and their issues and what they think should be done differently as well.
And that really gels with my previous incarnation where we were flying airplanes around the world. If we had incidents that were time critical, and this is operationally, the first thing we did was start talking to as many of the stakeholders as possible. And this is where time was actually measured in minutes, not necessarily hours. And that would be air traffic, that would be our operations controllers, but that would be the people on board the airplane, the crew and the passengers. And it's the same principle, is I would guess, Julie, that you're proposing here.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. And the other principles that are important to consider are things like fostering collaboration. So how can people get engaged through collaboration about raising ideas? And this can be done from everything from so-called world cafes, talking walls, a quick discussion in the corridor, whatever is appropriate. In fact, that gives people the opportunity to share their ideas and feel that these ideas will be listened to. Now, some of these ideas will just not work, but actually, again, research shows that where people are given the opportunity to say, this is what I think would be great and really improve the work I do, even if it doesn't become implemented, they still feel valued because someone has actually listened to them too. It's also about bringing in innovation. Sometimes change gets a bad name. Change should be about adding value. It should be about innovation as well, looking at doing things differently, looking at improving. So another principle that I suggest is about stimulating innovation and looking for ways that can be done that are appropriate to the culture, the environment of the company itself. Another key principle that is vital is about enhancing well-being. Change, if it isn't led effectively and there's an imbalance, so too much focus on process rather than people, it can negatively affect people's well-being. So it's looking at, from a people-centric approach to change, how can leaders and managers ensure that change is not impacting negatively on people's well-being. And the other principle is about promoting reflection and learning. So again, change should be a time to let's reflect on what we've done well. Let's share that across silos, across functions in organizations too. Let's give people the opportunity to think about, okay, what could we stop doing as a result of what we're learning from this change. And then the final principle is about building managers and building and developing teams too. So capabilities for change should be something that everybody has these days, not something that's quite unique and not something that a few so-called change managers or change agents have. It should be built into the skills, the knowledge, the experience, particularly that managers and teams have in organizations today.
And it's not this sort of it's not theoretical, is it? This is how organizations can actually make change work and change stick. It's
Absolutely.
about successful and sustainable change, and it requires that critical and often neglected people element is the proposition that you're putting forward that is actually backed by the massive amount of research. The point of this is it's how to make change work, how to make it successful, how to make it sustainable. And the field guide approach, which I derived from your book, I think is just exactly that. Leadership, leading change, not only from the top, but also from throughout the organization, bottom through to top, a diagonal slice.
Yeah. And I think what's important about it though, Barry, and I always say what people have to do when using my approach and the business transformation cycle and the principles is to make it their own. I think often where change has gone wrong in the past is that companies have used linear top-down models, and a lot of these models have different stages, everything from 8 steps to 10 steps to 5 steps. And they can't just be applied in organizations. When using the business transformation cycle, I always encourage managers and leaders to take it and make it your own. There'll be things that you want to emphasize. There might be things that you might want to add that will be important for the culture and the environment of the company in which you work as well.
Yeah, so it's an obvious statement, is it? It's not one size fits all. Building around the principles and building upon the principles that you've explained is actually then the toolbox that gives organizational leaders the opportunity to create this bespoke element whilst focusing on the key element, the key and often omitted element, which is the people side. And what about volunteerism, Julie? How does that feature in the thinking of an organization and an organizational leadership proposing change?
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit more about what you mean by volunteerism.
Well, we were talking then earlier about how we're consulting stakeholders at an early stage. Volunteerism has been demonstrated to encourage people to really get involved. They buy in because they're volunteered. They're part of the part of the process. If we take Rogers' diffusion curve, the more people you've got involved in the process, the greater the chance potentially of getting over that critical hump in the middle where you're pushing everything uphill initially. So how do you see volunteerism in terms of the organization's people, them volunteering to participate in the process of change and the program, and to repeat that so that change capability becomes a normal practice in what organizations do, because people are involved and actually they're getting the buzz from it.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it is so important to ask, for volunteers who wants to get involved in this, because often what happens in organizations, there is a theory called LMX, and LMX is about that. Often what happens is that people, particularly leaders, call on their in-group, the people that they trust, the people that they always ask, and they have built up relationships with. And what happens is there's also what's called an out group. So there's a whole lot of other people who are just never involved. So it's vital to get a diverse mix of people involved in change. And in the book, I've written a whole chapter on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I really strongly believe that we need to get different voices involved in organizational change and not just focus on the so-called in-group of people. So the same suspects that are always asked each time when it comes to looking at a business transformation.
And then a whole raft of people outside of the usual suspects who actually don't get it, aren't involved, and whose buy-in is very expensive. And actually, if they don't get the buy-in, the change program is doomed to failure, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Because these people question, why is this change happening? Why is it being impacted on? Why is it impacting my role? Why has nobody asked me? What does it mean for me? What will be the effect on my role as well? Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because I think there is this perception that change is a thing, it's an event, and I think from was it 500 BC, the only permanent thing, as was recorded by the Greek philosopher who I won't even try and pronounce, confirmed that the only permanent thing in life is change. And organizations seem to be, certainly in my perspective, see change as an incremental kind of, it happens and we then have to deal with it. We have a change program rather than being set up to continuously deal with change and transformation as just business as usual. What's your experience?
Yeah, you're
Is
right.
that reasonable?
It was Heraclius that said change is the only constant. Definitely.
Easy for you to say, Julie.
There are different types of change. There is what's called, there's incremental change, and that's the step change. I think it's referred to as Kaizen. And so it's change that's happening all the time around us. And sometimes we don't even see it happening. You might switch on your computer and the software you usually use has changed slightly, or there's a different setup. So that's when we're talking about constant change, that's what we're meaning. There's also transformational change. And transformational change hits the deep structure of an organization. It hits the strategy. It hits the overall structure. It can also hit the mission, the values. It affects how people do their job on a daily basis. So if you think about it, at the moment, there's lots of discussion about AI. AI is going to be transformational change. It's going to change what companies do, how they do it. It's going to change roles within it. And that's what really needs the attention. That's what we really need to focus on, the people-centric approach to change, because that's the change that really has a deep impact on how people work and behave in organizations too.
It's Julie, you've just picked up AI there as a very topical process that's rolling out now, where actually it would appear from certainly my research that the constraints around the use of AI have not really been clearly defined. All that's being suggested is that it just has to find its own path and route, because anybody who tries to impose regulation upon it is likely to be outcompeted either on a national level or an organizational level. If you take something like that, in terms of crafting the vision, the strategic vision, the higher purpose strategic vision within a change program or a transformation program, what's your view on stakeholders contributing to that vision? What are your thoughts of the stakeholder engagement to formulate the vision from the outset?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital to get them involved and engaged with looking at that vision. I mean, those of us that are old enough remember the days before there was email, before there was iPhones, before there was Zoom, etc. So we've seen technology. This isn't a new thing. We've seen technology. We've seen how it has progressed and how it's become part of the way that we live and work too. And I think we're at a great point now that we have the opportunity to get people involved in creating these visions for companies and creating the visions for how they work alongside AI as well. I mean, there's amazing innovation that's being done in that field at the moment. So it's, how can we get people and AI to work together in so-called super teams rather than it being seen as a threat?
And it needs to be remembered that AI is in service of people, not the other way around. We're back to people-centric change. Julie, if you were to summarize someone listening to this podcast who perhaps was perhaps slightly cynical about our approach to change and the people-centric element of it, what would your summary be to the leadership, the senior leaderships, the middle leadership, and those stakeholders in an organization, the key takeaways that you would give them from today's conversation?
Change only takes place when people change the way that they behave and the way that they work in organizations. That's what makes sure that change is implemented and sustained effectively. Change doesn't happen without people being engaged in it. And getting people involved as early as possible can ensure that change adds value and adds benefits to the change itself. I've worked on many large business transformations. And when I worked as an external consultant, we were often called in because the IT system wasn't working. Millions of pounds had been spent on a new system and it wasn't working. Why wasn't it working? Because people hadn't been involved in it at all. And as humans, we are very intelligent, and people can go back to doing what they have always done as well if they are not part of making the change happen and taking it forward too. So change is expensive, change can fail, but actually if we get people involved, then there's much more hope that it will be successful and that it will add value as well.
That is a perfect summary. Professor Julie Hodges and author of People-Centric Change, I cannot tell you how delighted I am to be having this discussion. And on behalf of our listeners and viewers, I'd love you to come back and we can develop this more. But Julie, thank you so much for your contribution and for joining us on the Just Great People podcast. That was a great summary. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Barry. Pleasure to talk with you.
Many thanks for listening to our Just Great People podcast. And you can really help us. Please do remember to like and subscribe, and please share this podcast with everybody you know. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.